We're going to start the nervous system with the building block of the nervous system, which is the neuron, the nerve cell. In general, obviously the functions of the nervous system mainly are to gather information, process it, and respond to information. What you have is just these different things that are happening. The peripheral nervous system is the nerves and the supporting cells. This is what collects information called input and sends it to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. It processes that information and figures out how to respond to it, which is called output. And that's delivered to whatever part of the body through the peripheral nervous system again. So there are two parts to the peripheral nervous system, or two different things. There's the gathering of information, and that's sensory, and then the response is motor. The messages that are carried by the nervous system are electrical signals that are called impulses, and they're transmitted by neurons. Here's a diagram of a neuron. Make sure you're familiar with the different parts. We're going to go through each of them. There are three types of neurons, as I was just referring to on a previous slide. Sensory neurons carry impulses from the sense organs to the spinal cord and brain, to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry impulses from the brain to the muscles and glands. And interneurons are in between. They process the information and send commands, so they're in between the sensory and the motor neurons. The cell body is the main part of the neuron. There's the nucleus and the cytoplasm, for the most part. And then these are called dendrites. They draw in the message, the impulse, from other neurons. Dendrites draw in the information. So they receive impulses from other neurons and send it to the cell body. The long fiber that carries impulses away is called the axon. So away begins with A, axon begins with A. That's what you see highlighted on this slide. The axon branches off at the end, and these are called axon terminals, the ends of the axons. Neurons can have dozens of dendrites that draw in messages from other neurons, but they usually have only one axon. In most animals, the axons and dendrites are clustered into bundles of fibers called nerves. Some nerves contain fibers from only a few neurons. Others can have hundreds or thousands of neurons. In some of the neurons, you have these little, it almost looks like beads, these blue beads here, and they're called the myelin sheath. Myelin is a form of insulation around the neuron, and it's not continuous. There are gaps in it called nodes where the axon is exposed. When the impulse moves along a myelinated axon, it jumps from one node to the next. So that causes the impulse to travel faster than it would through an axon without myelin. Myelinated axons are usually associated with responses and sensory information that would require quick processing. So like pain, extreme heat, things like that. A neuron at rest is negatively charged. That's called resting potential. Negative 70 millivolts inside compared to the outside. This is an electrical charge, the nerve impulse. So because that charge is sent from one neuron to the next, even the resting neuron is charged. It's negative. Active transport proteins, remember that from back in first semester. Active transport is when we're moving something from low concentration to high concentration, so against the concentration gradient. Active transport proteins pumps sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into it. The potassium channel proteins are ungated, so it makes it easier for potassium ions to diffuse back across. Remember, diffusion is from high concentration to low concentration, and that doesn't require any energy. So here's what's happening here. Because there's a higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell, the potassium ions are purple here in this diagram, as a result of active transport, there's a net movement of positively charged potassium ions out of the cell. As a result, the inside is negatively charged compared to the outside, producing the resting potential. So the take-home message here, the main thing you need to know, is that there's a negative charge inside the neuron to start out with when the neuron is at rest. The neuron stays at rest until it receives a stimulus that's big enough to start a nerve impulse. The impulse will travel quickly down the axon towards the axon terminals. We call it the neuron firing. Here's what's happening then. How is the movement happening? The neuron membrane contains thousands of gated ion channels that have to open up. So the first thing that happens is the sodium channels open. Positively charged sodium ions flow into the cell. So now the inside of the neuron is more positive. The reversal of charges here is called a nerve impulse or an action potential. Once the impulse passes, the sodium gates close and potassium gates open, allowing potassium ions to flow out. This restores the resting potential so that we're back negatively charged. The nerve impulse is called self-propagating. The flow of ions causes sodium channels just ahead of it to open. So that causes rapid movement of that impulse along the axon. If you imagine a domino drop, each domino falls and causes the next domino to fall in front of it. An action potential moves along a neuron in a similar manner, so it's almost one step ahead of itself. Not all stimuli start a nerve impulse. Our nervous system is selective in that way. The minimum level of stimulus is called threshold. Any stimulus that's weaker won't produce an impulse. The brain determines if it's strong or weak from the frequency of action potentials, like touch or pain. Weak stimulus might produce 3 or 4 action potentials. A strong one can fire as many as 100 times per second. What happens at the axon terminal? Motor neuron may pass impulses to a muscle cell, causing that muscle cell to contract. That transfer point, where the neuron is giving that impulse to another cell, is called a synapse, either a muscle cell or another neuron. That's called a synapse. And there's space there called the synaptic cleft. It separates the axon terminal from the next cell over. So there's actually space in here between the axon terminal and the dendrite of the next neuron. How does the impulse get across that gap? The answer is neurotransmitters. They're little vesicles. You can see them right here. Little vesicles down here filled with neurotransmitters. These are chemicals that transmit the impulse across a synapse to another cell. When an impulse arrives at the synapse, the vesicles release their neurotransmitters, diffuse across, high to low concentration, and they bind to receptors at the dendrite of the receiving cell. This opens the ion channels, and the nerve impulse is perpetuated into the next neuron. If this exceeds the new threshold, if it exceeds the cell's threshold, a new impulse begins. Then what happens to the neurotransmitters? They're released from the receptors on the cell's surface. They're either broken down and recycled, or they're taken up back to the axon terminal and recycled in that way. Recycled into parts or recycled whole. So if neurotransmitters aren't there, the impulse won't go from one nerve cell to the other. That message will be stopped.